Hi guys, and welcome to this new tutorial. In this one, after creating a dictionary that maps each of the lines with their IDs, we're going to create a list of all the conversations. So first, we must wonder, why do we need to do that? Well, we already have a list of the conversations, but we have a lot of metadata, and we want to only keep what's interesting for us, what we will use for the training. And what we'll only use for the training is actually this part on the right. That is the list of the conversations containing the line's IDs. And therefore what we're simply going to get in this tutorial is a huge list containing all the conversations, but only keeping this part. So we're going to get a list of all these lists here containing the line's IDs. Alright, so let's do this. It's going to be quite the same as what we did before. We first need to introduce a new list that we're going to call conversations. And to specify that we only want to keep the IDs, we're going to add here IDs. So this will be our list. And since this is a list, we don't introduce it as brackets, but as square brackets. And then starts the for loop. So for here, then the loop variable. And since we're going to iterate through the conversations of the conversations dataset, well, let's call the loop variable conversation. Perfect. In conversations. But then, just a little trick here. The last row of the conversations dataset is an empty row, so we won't include it, and therefore we will take the whole conversations dataset except the last one. And to do this, the trick is to do colon -1, because -1 is actually the last row of conversations, and by taking the colon here, we take the range from the beginning to this last row, but since the upper bound of a range in Python is excluded, this will exclude the last row, that is the empty row. So that's perfect, and now we're ready to start the for loop. Alright, so basically we just want to simplify the conversations in the conversations dataset. So what we'll do first is, as before, introduce a temporary variable that we will call underscore conversation. The underscore specifies that it is a temporary variable. Okay, so this will be equal to the result of cleaning the conversation. That is, we only want to keep the last part. And besides, since we will want this last part to be a list in a huge list of lists, each list being a conversation giving the line's IDs, well, we will need to remove all the square brackets and all the quotes and all the spaces. And you will understand why soon. Okay, so first, let's get the last part. So just to make sure we understand, we first need to get this part here. So how are we going to do that? Well, very simply, what we need to do first is a split, to split all the elements here. Then once we make the split, we will play with the index to get the last element after the split, which is this guy here. And then once we get this last element, that's where we will remove the square brackets by playing with the indexes. And then again, we will remove all the quotes and all the spaces. Okay, so let's do this. Conversation equals, so as before, we take our conversation, which is our loop variable, but representing each of the different conversations. Then we add the split. And again, we're going to split that by space plus 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 dollar plus 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 space. Alright, so with this, we make the split. But then, we need to get the last element after the split, which is this one. And so how are we going to get it? Well, we're simply going to take the last index of this list resulting after the split. And the last index, we can get it with the trick -1. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to add here in square brackets -1, and that takes the last element. So if I go back to it, that takes exactly this, including the square brackets. But then remember, we want to remove the square brackets, because if we keep the square brackets, well, in the end, when we append this element to our huge conversations IDs list, which will be in the end the huge list of all the conversations given by the line's IDs, well, you'll get a nasty result with many square brackets and many quotes. So we want to remove this. We need actually to only keep the line IDs without the quotes and without the square brackets. So first what we have to do is remove the square brackets, and to do this, well, that's very simple. We need to take the range of all the characters here, but without the first index, because the first index corresponds to this first square bracket, and without the last index, because the last index corresponds to this last square bracket. So let's do this. I'm adding here this range that I just mentioned, which will not include the first index, that is the index 0, so we'll start from index 1, and which will not include either the last index, which is index -1. And that's perfect because the upper bound in Python is excluded. So that doesn't take the first index, 0, and that doesn't take the last index, -1. Great. So by doing this, we just removed the square brackets. And now we have to remove the quote, and then we will remove eventually the spaces. So let's first remove the quotes. The trick to do that is to use the replace function and actually to replace the quotes by nothing. That will just remove them. So let's do it. Let's use the replace function, which takes 2 arguments. The first argument is what we want to replace. So we want to replace the quote, the single quote, but that we have to put in double quotes. And the second argument is what we want to replace this first argument by, and that is nothing. But we need to put the nothing in double quotes, like that. So we're replacing the single quote by nothing, so we're removing it. Perfect? So that removes the single quote, but then remember we also want to remove the spaces, and so we're going to use the same trick, another replace, and we're going to replace this time the space by, again, nothing. And this will simplify everything. We will get, in the end, only the L194 up to L197 without any quotes and without any spaces and without any square brackets, just with the comma. And we need to keep the comma because then we're going to make another split to get these elements L194 up to L197. And why do we want to get these elements? Because that's what we want to put in each of the final lists of the huge list of the conversations. All right? The best way to be convinced about what we're doing is to try to do this without this part actually, without all this part, that is, as what we did here. Try to execute that for loop when we finish it at the end of this tutorial without this part, and you'll see that you'll get a nasty list with too many square brackets and too many quotes, and this will be ugly. Not only this will be ugly, but also this will be syntactically incorrect. So that's why we are doing this right now. And now the last thing that we need to do is just to append this cleaned temporary conversation to the whole list, the huge list of all the conversations. So that's why right now I'm taking this huge list, conversations underscore IDs, then dot, and then I use the append function to append this cleaned conversation. And therefore, in the append function, I just need to input underscore conversation. And then, as I just said, we use the split to get what we're interested in, that is the lines IDs. And to get them, we just need to split this last element here that was cleaned without the square brackets and without the quotes and without the spaces by the commas. So we'll only get this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. All right, so let's split that by the comma. All right, so now let's look at the result of what we just did. So I'm going to select these 4 lines of code here and execute. Perfect. Executed properly. And now let's have a look at our conversations IDs list. And this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted a huge list of all the conversations given by only the lines IDs. And so what I was telling you is try to get that huge list of conversations without what we did here, without taking the ranges here and without the replace. Well, you will get a nasty and ugly huge list of conversations with many square brackets and too many quotes. And that will be ugly and not correct. This is not what we want. We want a simple huge list of lists, each list containing the lines IDs. Perfect. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. And the next step will be very interesting because we're going to get a lot closer to the final structure, because that's where we'll start to sort the lines into some questions, which will be the inputs of the neural network, and the answers, which will be the targets of the neural network. So we're getting closer and closer to the neural network, but keep in mind that we are unfortunately still in the data preprocessing phase. So let's do that in the next tutorial, and until then, enjoy DeepNLP.